Ask Chuck.
You noticed how the left and right seem to have switched places when it comes to cultural orthodoxy. He goes, when I moved to D.C. from Alabama, I felt judged by moderate Dem staffers for things like smoking. But my GOP and libertarian friends never cared. Is this hall monitor vibe a bigger challenge for the Democratic Party? And can they shed it? Would love to hear your thoughts. You're right. I especially sort of Southern Democrats, right? I'll give you another one. It's not as common, right, for a Democrat in D.C. to be church going. And yet it's quite common in the South for everybody to be church going. So I think you're not wrong that there's a little bit of that going on. But let me flip the script here. I where I thought you were going at first had to do with the nanny state. And I sort of more focused on sort of the bizarre, the bizarreness, if you will. It's not really that bizarre anymore of Kennedy, at least on the right when it comes to that, which is, 10 years ago when Michael Bloomberg was trying to get rid of the big gulp, the right went crazy. Sarah Palin came out and gave speeches with a big gulp as a prop. It was their way of going after the crazy left. I don't know if we were calling it woke then, right? Now who's the one trying to get rid of sweets and trying to get rid of, trying to decide, no, you shouldn't eat this and you shouldn't eat that, right? It's suddenly the right. So I do think these things go cyclical. I'll give you another thing, right? It was more likely you'd see a Democratic voter or candidate would, if you saw somebody with more than one tattoo, you would assume they were their politics were on the left. Now these days, if you see somebody with more than one tattoo, you might assume their politics is on the right. So I do think some of this thing can be generational or subgenerational, and we don't see it. I do think on smoking, there's a few things. Smoking, maybe I would have said 3 or 4 years ago, tackle football, where if you were on the left, you might get judged by your friends on the left on some of these things. So look, I do think one of the core problems, and I've said this, is that if there is a basic sort of one-line descriptor problem that the Democrats have, is that the Democrats seem to be always wanting to tell you how to live your life, where Republicans are trying to are always going out of their way to agree with your grievance about life, right? It's sort of the idea that in general, Democrats are telling you, well, no. That isn't the most important issue. This is really the most important issue, versus the Republicans are saying, oh, you think that's the most important? Okay. Right. They go out of their way to try to agree with the voters. Democrats go out of their way to try to tell voters, no, you should think about it this way. So yes, I think I think what you've hit on something. I don't think it's quite as clean as you've gotten it, but I know exactly what you mean. And I think there is a slight, it does feel as if you're somehow, when I was growing up, it was the Republicans that were the judgy party. Now it feels like it's the Democrats that are the judgy party. If we wanted to be simplistic about it, and it's something they have to shed. I think they know it.
Ask Chuck.
Here's a good question from a local government administrator from Peoria, Illinois. How's it playing in Peoria? An old phrase for an older set. Chuck, I make a genuine effort to source my news from multiple perspectives, and the Chuck ToddCast has been one of my sources for a long time. Today, I have two mostly unrelated questions. First, every empire rises and falls. Are we currently living through the fall of the American empire? Second, as a timestamp, I'm listening to your interview with Ian Bremer. What do you think it would actually take for the MAGA base to abandon Trumpism, not necessarily Trump himself, given how strong echo chambers are for both parties? Hope you find either or both of these worth tackling on a future pod. Happy Independence Day, Scott Sorrell. Scott, I appreciate the question. And I guess I would tackle it, the last people to know when an empire falls are those that are part of the empire, right? I'm way back in my previous life when I was working at National Journal and also working a bit with the Atlantic. They had an editor there who wrote a book that was titled Are We Rome? And I think it came out in 2010, right? So you're talking, here we are 15 years later. And for what it's worth, I feel like about every 15 or 20 years, this concept of, hey, are we in the late stages of something? Is this like late stage Roman Empire's collapse, et cetera, et cetera? And, I think it's fair to say that a fall of a country's politics or constitution, or however you would call the fall of the American empire, it's going to feel, I'm sure it would feel the same way, just like the metaphor about bankruptcy, right? First it happened slowly, then quickly, right? All of a sudden it's gone, right? And we've seen that when the fall of leaders, right? When Assad fell, whoa, I think eventually we all thought eventually Assad's going to fall, but nobody knew when it was going to happen. And then when it happened, it just happened. It was like gone overnight. Now he's shopping at Russian grocery stores. So it is one of those things that that I think the better way to look at it is, if we're not careful, we could end up on the path and we could see the fall of the great democratic experiment, right? The challenge to capitalism is that if we don't figure out how to reform capitalism in a way that feels that everybody's got a shot, if people feel as if they don't have access to the American dream, the country's politics is going to collapse. It just is. Because it's when people feel like they don't have an ability to make a living, they don't have an ability to better their lives on their own, that's when governments fall. That's when revolutions happen. That's when you're able to gather people up. So if you look at it through that prism, right? If you look at it to see, how did Venezuela fall? How did Turkey fall, if you will? There are a few things that concern me. I think our rural urban divide is very, makes us very vulnerable to a collapse. Because when you look at what happened to Venezuela, it was an authoritarian taking advantage of the rural poor and pitting them against the elites of Caracas. Erdogan got to power using both religion and resentment at the elites in Istanbul. He's weakest in Istanbul, because that's where the money people live. That's where the elites live. That's where basically the pro small d democracy folks live. So the fact that there is a monolithic political identity in rural America, I think, is potentially dangerous for us. And it's why the Democratic Party has to find a way back into, because that's where the seeds of this could get worse. So I'm, I wouldn't put this as a flashing red light, but it's one of those, if we continue to make bad decisions over the next decade or so, then yeah, we may look back and say, oh, it's late stages of the fall of the American empire. But I choose to be optimistic. I choose to believe that we've had these near misses before: McCarthyism, isolationism, a civil war, and we got through it. We're in one of those moments. We're going to get through it. Why do I believe that? Because why do I want to believe the alternative? As for your second question, what would get MAGA? Well, what brought the isolationists? What brought the isolationists back to the mainstream in the 1930s? Pearl Harbor. So you're asking, what would it take to for the MAGA world to essentially abandon Trumpism? I think it's two things. One, if Trumpism harms their livelihood. So I think the tariff war, the trade wars, makes it very vulnerable when it doesn't work. And I just don't think it's going to work, but I'm going to be sitting here watching with the rest of you. When it fails, the people that are going to get harmed the most is that MAGA coalition, particularly, like I said, rural farmers, those in the agricultural sector, are going to get hit the hardest. That could be one thing. But what brought the isolationists back was, an attack on Americans themselves. So, I have one of my theories as to why we're so polarized today is we don't have the Cold War as a way to sort of keep people from going to their political fringes. right? The threat of war with Russia, nuclear war, fear of that, the Cold War kept the fringes in the fringe, and party leadership left and right did their best to sort of, right? There was an agreement who the enemy was. There was a disagreement on how to confront the enemy, but that was the divide. So, I mean, those would be the two ways that I could envision MAGA leaving Trumpism and these folks leaving Trumpism.